Welcome to the podcast where we celebrate innovation for a happy planet. I am your host, Abigail Carroll. Today we travel to Pine Island, Florida, where entrepreneur Megan Sorby is building an aquaculture facility that promises to not only bring a protected fish back to our plates, but also to restore coastal resiliency while doing it. Let's hear it from Megan. Welcome to the podcast, Megan.
Thank you so much for having me, Abigail. It's great to be here.
So you and your husband have co-founded a company called Pine Island Redfish. Tell me what you're doing.
I'm a co-founder and the CEO of Pine Island Redfish, which is a new land-based recirculating aquaculture development, culturing redfish or red drum for the domestic seafood market. So we have a conventional RAS system to culture our redfish. A RAS system is a recirculating aquaculture system. So it's all the steps that you may or may not be familiar with, but the fish are in tanks on land. We pull seawater through saltwater wells on our site, and then we bring that water in, filtered into the fish tanks. We send it out through solids filtration, which is through drum filters, through a biofilter, through foam fractionation and UV sterilization, and then back to the fish. And we do that process multiple times. That's your typical recirculating aquaculture system. What we do that's unique is that beyond working with our natural geology to source our seawater, we also use it on the backside to recapture our nutrients and contain that little bit of water that we are replacing. So with our salty nutrient waste that's coming from culturing the fish, we actually have a really powerful fertilizer that we can use to culture salt-tolerant plants. Why would we want to culture salt-tolerant plants? Some of the most powerful plants that we have in terms of combating climate change are red mangroves. And mangroves specifically offer us multiple benefits. They have huge capacity to sequester carbon, far more powerful than our typical tropical forest plants. But also they stabilize our shorelines in coastal communities so that we can combat sea level rise and the increased frequency of intense weather events. They can decrease coastal flooding by upwards of 60%. So they're a critical species for us. So by utilizing the waste stream from our fish to fertilize the culture of these plants, and these plants can be taken offsite for remediation projects, we actually can grow them twice as fast as a conventional nursery setting. And they also replant with better success because they've been cultured in that seawater environment already.
Amazing. You're in Florida.
Yes.
And are there mangroves nearby that have suffered considerably in the recent years that you're particularly focused on?
So our mangroves, the work that we're doing both with public and private partnerships for replanting and remediation projects right now are focused in South Florida, but we hope that that spreads wider to the entire state and hopefully to some of the other areas where lots of remediation activity with mangroves specifically is going on. In Florida, we have a significant need. The loss of mangroves on the East Coast and West Coast has been quantified as high as 80 to 90% of what has historically been along our coastal areas. And that's largely because of development. So really, it's our goal that through these public and private partnerships for groups that are focused specifically in increasing our coastal resilience, our coastal community resilience, that we can work with them and supply them a steady stream of these plants.
Yeah. So aquaculture is going to save our coastline. For all the naysaying, there's a lot of uncertainty and negative bias against aquaculture. But first, I want to know why redfish. Tell me about redfish and why that's a good fish for you to be growing.
It's an interesting set of questions to kind of pair together because in reality, redfish is the species that is the story that we should be telling with aquaculture in general. We have a species that was so popular back in the 80s that we did what humans do best, and we fished the redfish natural populations to the brink of extinction. The growth and uptick of the commercial harvest was so significant that it triggered protection from both the state and federal levels. And
Wow.
because of that awareness, we now have a sport or recreational fishery specifically for redfish that can be valued as high as $9 billion just in the state of Florida alone. So
What does Can you explain what that means? What is a recreational fishery?
recreational fishing is just going out like you and your family on a fishing boat and targeting, redfish or snapper or really any type of sport fish. And there are limits for how many you can take personally, but they can never be sold. So it's only for
Right.
your personal use. Some species you can't keep them at all. It's catch and release only. Redfish is
Yeah.
one where there is a very limited harvest that you as an individual can take. And
Yeah.
we have maintained that and maintained a really valuable tourist experience that involves our ecosystem around us, which is great.
So the $9 billion is basically the whole tourism value around the fishing of the redfish. It's not that there's $9 billion of redfish
Correct.
being fished. Okay,
Correct.
just want to clarify.
No,
I
thanks.
was like, well, that's a pretty big number.
Yeah, but it
Um,
just goes to show you how valuable ecosystem services can be in terms of feeding into our economy
yeah,
and really maintaining the wild fishery serves us better in that capacity than it is, taking it for commercial harvest. But what
right.
that means is we have this gap in a seafood category where the demand still exists, but our only source is now an imported frozen replacement. And that
Yeah,
seems silly to us when this is a fish that is near and dear to our hearts, first and foremost, but also native to our coastlines.
yeah,
And it's one that people feel unintimidated to cook at home. They're familiar with it. So it's a gateway fish for getting more people putting seafood on their plate. So that's what excites us about redfish. The fact that the demand is still there, but also in the same regard when you think about aquaculture and starting new aquaculture operations, which you are very familiar with, Abigail. One of the big bottlenecks is the knowledge base around growing a new species. And when we decided to protect this fish, the state put a lot of investment into understanding the culture process, specifically the early life stages, which tend to be the most challenging, because they were doing aquaculture for restocking to enhance the
mm,
wild fishery. So we actually have a really great understanding of the culture process. And now we're just taking that understanding and putting it into a commercial activity where we can start to grow these fish and put them back into the marketplace without impacting the wild capture fishery, or really in the case of our site and our facility, without impact to our natural environment.
yeah. So, are you doing the hatchery yourself, or are you working with a hatchery?
We are doing the hatchery ourselves. So we have broodstock. So right now, just a little bit of background, we are operating in a demonstration scale facility inside Moat Marine Laboratories Aquaculture Park. And that's in Sarasota, Florida. We have broodstock here and we have some small scale production of both fish and plants that just demonstrates what the larger facility will look like.
What, Pine Island. Tell me about Pine Island. I think it's got a unique story with respect to aquaculture.
Yeah. Pine Island is this really unique agriculture holdout along the coast of Florida. So, as most people would imagine, there's so many stakeholders in coastal areas that have other uses. They want to do housing or working waterfront. There's loads of different uses for coastal areas. But Pine Island has really held out in the way that they do community planning and in their island ordinances to maintain the agriculture activity and fishing activity that has been integral to the island's community survival. And with that, what you see is that there is an island along the coast that is still very agriculture focused. So most of the activity on the island is with respect to citrus growth and also mango and lychee, but also culturing plants for landscaping purposes. What's great is that they, as a historical fishing community, they also are really familiar both with the fisheries, the wild fisheries, but also with the potential for aquaculture. So around the island, you see several shellfish leases, but there's also a land-based facility already culturing shrimp there, and it's been there for about 10 years. And the work that the owner of that facility, Robin Pearl, has done to not just talk about his process, but really truly engage with the community and educate people about his culture process has really laid a fantastic foundation for other aquaculture operators coming in behind him.
Nice. And will you be able to establish your long-term facility there?
Right. So we do, our site is on Pine Island. We have just over 90 developable acres. The other 70 acres of our site is a fantastic mangrove area that protects us from any coastal flooding, which is nice.
And you can always add to it.
We can always add to it. But it helps tell the story on the plant side of our business. But our site was historically an agriculture site. It's been used for citrus way back in the early 1900s. But then ultimately was utilized for other agriculture purposes up to a few years ago. And really, the geology of the island is what allows us to do what we're doing. So there is a really fantastic saltwater layer in that early lime rock. So we pull it straight through a really nice shell bed. We're also isolated from the freshwater resource. So if you imagine the layers of a cake, it's seawater on the top. There's a really thick mud layer. And then below that mud layer, which is called a confining layer, there's fresh water. And that fresh water is where people get their domestic wells and things like that. But because we're drawing from the surface and there's that really thick mud layer, we have no impact or no chance of impacting anybody's freshwater resources. So that's how we can establish that we're here and we're utilizing different resources than other people.
And so that's why you don't have to pull directly from the ocean too for your for your water, because you've got this well. That's really interesting and unique, I think.
It was really the goal to make sure that if there was a way that we could keep infrastructure out of the water, both on the intake and on the effluent side, that we do that. And that is the really unique thing about Florida. And many of our coastal sites have interesting geology that can support marine aquaculture in this way.
We'll be right back after a word from our sponsors. I'd like to thank Gulf of Maine Research Institute and Bold Ocean Ventures for their support of Happy Planet podcast. GMRI and Bold Ocean Ventures have partnered to create a mission-driven venture capital fund supporting the growth of innovative, sustainable, ocean-related businesses. Listeners may remember Patrick Breeding, who was on our show last year to talk about Marin Skincare and its clinically proven formula that uses glycoproteins from Maine lobsters to treat eczema and dry, damaged skin. This company has since become wildly successful with their lobster lotion, and Patrick is inviting listeners to a 20% discount on their products by using the coupon code HAPPYPLANET on their website, Marin Skincare. I actually use this product myself, and I highly recommend it. For a blue economy to thrive, people need to use more sustainable products. But which products? And will consumers actually adopt them? Innovators like you are hustling to figure this out. Spark number 9 can tell you if there's demand for your product. Spark markets your product before it's built using online advertising so you launch smarter. Have a big idea? Vet it with Spark before you build. Visit Spark online at www.sparkno9.com or find them on LinkedIn. Hey, and I want to give a quick shout out to all of the Blue Economy folks out there. Do not miss the Oceanovation Festival on June 19th and 20th in The Hague, Netherlands. Join over 450 global innovators, investors, and experts transforming the blue economy for a healthier ocean. For more information, visit their website, oceanovation.live. Welcome back to the podcast. So people have concerns about eating fish that has been grown in an aquaculture facility, everything from feed to antibiotics to what kind of medicines they're being given. Can you help break that down and maybe demystify it?
Absolutely. I think, first and foremost, I think that there's been a lot of negativity out there around the certifying agencies or the certifications that are out there for responsible seafood production. And I can attest as an operator, and I'm sure you know yourself, Abigail, that the audit process for achieving some of those certifications is a significant lift to make sure that you are adhering to these responsible practices. So I would tell the day-to-day consumer out there to rely on some of those labels and to answer questions, some of the questions that they have about antibiotic use and responsible practices from those certifications and what those certifications mean. And the websites for those are very thorough. We have things like Aquaculture Stewardship Council or Best Aquaculture Practices. And even at the state level, to achieve your licensing to sell your products, you have certifications where you have to meet certain criteria. So I think that's first and foremost. I think like most farming, there's been a lot of misinformation out there about the food culture practices that are undertaken in order to get that animal, whether it be a chicken, a pig, an oyster, a fish, from start to your plate. And really, it comes back to what we were talking about earlier, which is just educating about the process. We are a facility that doesn't use antibiotics, and that's perhaps one of the key benefits of land-based indoor recirculating aquaculture is the fact that because you're inside, because you have such significant filtration around your systems, you have far less biosecurity risk or disease risk that might warrant the use of antibiotics.
Right.
So that's one of the big benefits. Feed, is an interesting topic because I think all of us in our industry see feed as one of the key areas for growth. Yeah. Which is to say that, yes, right now, most fish are grown on a diet that does include a high percentage of fish meal and fish oil. And that those sources for fish meal and fish oil come from wild capture fisheries. But also that is shifting to lessen what we refer to as the fish in, fish out ratio, which is to reduce that amount, that dependence on wild capture fisheries, and use things like fish trimmings that would have gone to waste typically. Those can be used in fish feed and recycled so that we are, again, becoming a more circular process. There are also fantastic advancements in terms of replacing items with other proteins and oils. So there are great initiatives out there for replacing fish oil with algae oil. And that is key in the species selection of the finfish or other animal that you choose to grow. Redfish, for example, in research has shown significant reception to alternative ingredients. And I think that's a place where we're really excited to explore more as we get up and growing, is that, those replacements can help us be more efficient, more circular going forward.
Interesting. What about insect proteins?
Yes. Oh, fantastic. We're really excited about insect protein. We're really hoping that sector continues to grow at the rate that we're experiencing right now. The biggest knock on it, I would say, is just the amount of production that we're capable of at this point in time. We drastically need to scale the industry in order to meet the potential demand that it could fill.
if you are what you eat, are these different inputs like insects going to change the quality or the taste of the meat?
That's part of the research process. Just the substitution of algae oil for fish oil, is that going to change the meat quality coming from the fillet? And that's something that's part of that engagement. Is when we do feed trials where we try these new inclusions, we take those fish all the way through their normal process so that we
Yeah.
get a sense of how do they compare in growth, but how do they compare in taste at the end. And that's why
Yeah.
some of this work isn't happening overnight. It takes time to produce those results and make sure that we're still ending up where we expect to be, on both of those fronts. So and that goes, I think, to the larger point, which is that we're living in this time where there's podcasts, where there's a 24/7 news cycle, and never before have we domesticated a protein with that type of visibility from the average consumer. So I think that should inspire some confidence in the seafood market and in the consumer market, because they are seeing it in real time and they have the power to demand a certain level of transparency in the process and understanding of what we are changing to improve our overall efficiency.
Yeah. So where are you in terms of your process? You're building a facility now?
We are hoping to be in construction on the larger facility at the end of the year. So we're currently launching our Series A fundraising to support that. But ultimately, we have worked over the past year to be in a really strong place. We have a brood stock. We have small scale production going on. We also have a pretty shovel ready design, and we have all the permits in place to begin construction as soon as we are fully funded.
Who do you go to for funding in a situation like this?
We have been supported, like most aquaculture startups, by individual investors who are really interested in the space. We have a core
Yes.
team who comes from all different backgrounds, but somehow got introduced through different avenues into the aquaculture sector and simply said, hey, this is cool. And that's really where we're trying to grow. But we also have had interest from larger institutional investment, and we have been supported by agricultural banks that
Yeah.
see this as the wave of the future in terms of
Yeah.
food production. We have fantastic partners with Farm Credit of Central Florida, who from day one came to the site, tried our fish, and said, we are here to support you. Let's grow this together. And that's a really inspiring place to be sitting, where you have excited people behind you and helping to support these early days, but also banks like Farm Credit stepping in and saying, we believe that this is the future of food.
So tell me, how did you get into this?
um,
Where did you go wrong?
That's a great way of putting it, Abigail. Where did I go wrong? It's such an interesting field, right? As you well know, and certainly as an entrepreneur yourself, it's one of those things where the most exciting thing about aquaculture is on a day-to-day basis, you wear multiple different hats. You get to be a biologist and a water chemist and a plumber, sometimes an
Yes.
electrician in an emergency.
Although those guys make a lot of money, so
They do. But that, I think that's really what drew me to it. I always wanted to be a marine biologist from a very young age. And I followed that passion and realized that the area of study where I would get to work as closely with the animal as you possibly can and get to know them on an individual level was really in the farming process. And I specialized a lot of my time in broodstock development. And like I said, you get to know individuals on a really one-to-one basis at that life stage.
yeah.
But I found the whole process and the farming process, particularly in land-based systems, as very interesting. And why redfish, and why, previous to redfish, has it always been alternative species, or what we refer to as alternative species, new and up and coming finfish in the aquaculture space is because I figured they already have enough people looking at salmon. I could be utilized elsewhere. So both my partner and I have moved around doing barramundi, doing black cod on the West Coast in Washington and British Columbia. We've farmed red drum before for restocking purposes, and most recently yellowtail kingfish, all of which are species that are exciting. They're interesting in their own capacity, and they have tremendous potential for filling niches in our seafood sector that are underfulfilled.
Yep. But you and your husband decided to go out on your own, and I know there are other co-founders.
Sure.
What was that leap like, and why did you decide to do that rather than stay with these big companies where you could have had a pretty secure life?
That's a great question, and I'm not sure one I have a fully formed answer to yet. Oftentimes, what we see or what we have seen in our path to this point has been that you, as an operator, as the person that knows the fish culture process most intimately, is not always in the driver's seat of the decision making and the spending of funds and larger decisions about how the facility should be set up and how it should be run. So that's what we tried to do over the course of our careers, probably inadvertently, but it happened that way anyway, was to try and be as well-rounded as possible. So at each step, we were focused in different areas, each of us individually, but in each individual role, where, you take your time learning water chemistry, you take your time just focusing on hatchery phase, taking time just to do the grow out part, or just to understand processing the fish and marketing side, and getting that well-rounded picture, I think, really got us to the point where we said, hey, there are some efficiencies that we aren't seeing realized in facilities that are out there to date. How can we make an impact and show that aquaculture can be not just environmentally sustainable, but economically viable as well? And both are key to the survival of the industry. And I think that was kind of the thought process with how we got here. It remains to be seen about delivering it on that mindset, but that is certainly the goal. And every opportunity that we've had fantastic supporters, mentors, and colleagues. I was speaking with someone recently, and some of the best teachers that we've had along the way have been people that have been so micro focused on one particular part of the process, then they know it so incredibly well that they teach you a real passion about that piece of the puzzle, but also emphasize its importance in the bigger picture of making a facility operate. So we are grateful for the pathway that we've had.
So do you ever get any pushback from investors about working with your husband?
All the time. There's always questions about it. But I think what we always say is, if you think about business development in the United States and where is the bulk of business activity? Well, I wouldn't say it's in huge corporations. We have so many small businesses, and this country was built on small businesses. Well, small businesses and farms in particular have been family based. And that's potentially the power in it. We always say that they get more working hours for their investment than they think, because what do you do when you go home? You talk to your partner, your partner or your family about your workday. Well, when you share the same or similar work days, it just, the farm work continues at home. But I think it's forgotten that it's not that out of the ordinary.
Right. So what do you guys do for fun when you're not talking about redfish?
We go fishing.
I love it.
We love the outdoors. And most recently, we have added to our family. We have a 2.5-year-old named Piper. She is the light of our lives, but also the challenge. at the age of 2 and 3. But she loves coming into the aquaculture facility and
Oh,
feeding the
sure.
fish and running around. She was planting mangroves with us last week, this year's new set of propagules. So it is truly a family business, but she keeps us on our toes and certainly keeps us busy. I think probably the funniest part is, I'll get a call from my partner, Tom, who, he'll say, well, what should I feed her for dinner? And I say to him, you've literally kept hundreds of thousands of fish alive. This is a fish of your own species. We can figure this out together.
Right. Or redfish. Guess
Yes.
what? Redfish for breakfast, lunch, and dinner.
Yes, to support everything that's happening, hopefully it will be a staple for us.
Well, you are addressing both fish shortage and a growing need for more food and more proteins on the planet, and climate change with your mangroves and helping build back coastal resilience. Are you optimistic about the future of the planet?
I think we all have to be. But in that optimism, we can't be short on our vigor to take action quickly. It's so interesting when you list all those things out. Yes, it's a multifaceted approach to trying to address multiple needs, but that's really where our biggest strength is finding ways to address multiple problems in a more singular and circular process. You know this from oyster farming, right? Oysters are a fantastic food and such a specialty, but they also are highly nutrient dense, and
Yeah,
they provide
the perfect
this
food.
this really rich food source for us. But more than that, they address water quality issues. I mean, the amount of oysters that we historically had along the New England coast,
No, I know.
we wouldn't have any water quality issues. So it's bringing that back and looking at all of our food systems for that type of multi-tiered solution. And that's really what we were trying to do with Pine Island Redfish conceptually in the early days, was think about, well, we don't want to be just another farm. What else can we be doing? And this is where, taking inspiration from regenerative agriculture, from the boom in seaweed farming that's happening, which shout out to everyone in that space, tremendous strides, particularly along the US coast in recent years. It's these are solutions that can address multiple problems. Besides mangroves, we have been trialing salt tolerant vegetables as well. Other salt marsh type species that are also very nutrient dense. Right now in our systems, we have sea purslane and barilla, which are two salt tolerant species. And sea purslane has one of the highest inclusions of omega 3s in a vegetable that we know. And that, in addition to that density of nutrients, is also critical in keeping sand on our beaches. You can walk out to our coast right out here on the Gulf Coast, and you can pick it right off the beach. But if you dug down into the sand, you would see this tremendous network of root structure that is really what is holding that sand dune in place. And I think when you link that up with the fact that it can provide us food, it's extremely powerful. To answer your question, the outlook for the future is one that I think can be very bright if we start to approach things with this circularity in mind.
Yeah. And do you have advice for entrepreneurs today?
Surround yourself with people that are smarter than you. I could spend days and days and probably years speaking about the people, particularly in the seafood sector in general, who have been just tremendous supporters, tremendous colleagues and friends who, just are willing to sit there and talk through something with you. My partner and I, we make no bones about the fact that we are very well versed in the fish farming process, talking about structuring of deals and that type of investment space is part that we're still learning. But we've had fantastic input and support from others in the industry that have been through this process or continue to go through this process. And having that network to bounce thoughts off of, to work through your concepts with, is invaluable.
Yeah. Yeah. Well, thank you so much for coming today, Megan. It's just been a really interesting story, and I love the upcycling of the wastewater. I love the circularity of what you're doing. It's really impactful.
Well, thank you for doing this podcast. I was saying just yesterday that the biggest lift that we have in our sector is getting people comfortable and confident in our process. And that
Yeah.
happens through continued outreach. So podcasts
Yeah.
like this are critical. Thank you for giving us a platform to talk about what we're doing.
For more about Megan and her business, we've provided information in our show notes. Thank you once again for listening. Please follow Happy Planet wherever you tune in and leave us a rating and review. It really does help new listeners discover the show. Happy Planet was reported and hosted by me, Abigail Carroll. I am also the executive producer. Zoe Bailey is our editor, and composer George Brandel Egloff created our theme music. Learn more about my work and get in touch by visiting happyplanetpodcast.com.